of course, as it's 3 weeks since the election, and of course, you know, we remember from 3 weeks ago, workers were breathing a sigh of relief, and I think to some degree they're still breathing a sigh of relief. And whether they voted Labour or Green or Lib Dem or even maybe some Reform voters are just happy that the Tories have gone. People remember election night, watching this whole parade of monstrous creatures losing seat after seat after seat after seat, and you know you'd have to have heart of stone not to be amused by that, really. And so you know that's fun. But obviously, in that 3 weeks, I know most of you probably had time to check the results. You've had a look at your your websites and so on. So I won't go into massive detail, but I will touch on some of the most important features of them. Other people will come in and deal with Scotland because I haven't done a detailed analysis of that. But really, this is a picture of two elections. The first one is Tory seats that went to Labour, or in fact went to Lib Dem. And that's been combined with the growth. So he had a swing to Labour or a swing to Lib Dem combined with the growth of Reform. Beyond even what the old UKIP got at its height around about just before 2015. Which obviously split the Tory vote and allowed a relatively modest swing to Labour to be translated into an enormous number of seats. And what was clear that what was happening was that voters were doing whatever they could to kick the Tories out. And in some cases, it could have been much worse. In some cases, like Suella Braverman's seat, people were not sure who was the second place candidate. So, you know, because it was a new seat with new boundaries, so they couldn't judge if they'd best vote Lib Dem or best vote Labour. So had they sorted that out, they could have got rid of Suella Braverman on that basis. So, as you know, Labour won a huge tally of seats, 412 seats, I think, on only 34%, just under 34% of the popular vote, which is an extraordinarily low figure. The Lib Dems won 72 seats, mainly in the south and southwest, almost no increase in the vote. And the Greens doubled their vote and they took seats from the Tories in Suffolk and in rural Herefordshire. And so you got some astonishing results came through. I was one of those people that sat up all night because I'm sad that way. And the town where I spent my teenage years is a town in Banbury in Oxfordshire, which has now got a Labour MP for the first time in 100 years. Aldershot, where my own brother trained as a soldier and has been Tory since ever. South Dorset, where we unseated a member of the Drax family who represented Dorset for 300 years, on which they bought back in the day on the proceeds of slavery. And of course, there's not a single Tory MP anywhere in Cumbria, which is an extraordinary situation. But the other side of this election was a revolt in the main safe seats, or what were previously considered safe seats in the big urban centres where younger and or more radical voters live, and especially with areas with high Muslim votes, with a large Muslim community, like the one where I live, in fact. But it's not only in a Muslim protest. That would be a wrong way to characterize it. It's a massive protest, and it's bordering. You could almost use the word collapse, really, of the Labour vote, which I'll come to a bit later. In Bristol Central, you had the Greens. The Green took a seat off a Labour cabinet minister in Bristol Central, again, which is not mainly a Muslim area. That's to do with a young, educated, kind of progressive population in the centre of Bristol who voted Green, and they won the seat handsomely and kicked out Thangham Debonair, the Labour shadow cabinet minister. Of course, Corbyn and Faiza Shaheen got much bigger votes than were expected, and 4 Muslim community-based independents won seats. But actually, which in itself is extraordinary. Independents just don't win seats at British general elections. They just generally don't do that. And this time they did. And actually the results disguise the depth of the crisis that Labour could possibly face in these areas. In Birmingham, it could easily have been 2 or 3 more seats. There were, a few hundred votes could have delivered more seats in Birmingham to the Labour Party, and that's the same throughout those big urban centres. Of course, in the neighbouring constituency to mine, in Ilford North, West Streeting was almost defenestrated by a very young, new local independent candidate. And even when they lost, even when these seats weren't won, the vote went way beyond what Left Horizons predicted. I mean, it's safe to say we didn't predict it, and most people didn't predict votes of 10, 20, 30% for these independents or for general sort of half independent, half Muslim, half left candidates. And sometimes even higher than 30%. It's absolutely unprecedented, and it just shows the level of anger against the Labour Party and the Tory Party, of course, over the question of Gaza, and also the general sort of abandonment by Labour of some of its more radical programme. But there was a really dramatic vote, the Labour vote, for example, where I live in East London. The Labour vote dropped below 50% where I live, in Leighton and Wanstead, and it's the same happened in Holborn and St Pancras, in Keir Starmer's own seat. In Bethnal Green and Stepney, just a couple of tube stops away from me, the Labour's vote dropped by almost 40%, a 40% percentage drop in Labour's vote in Bethnal Green, because where you had a Muslim MP, but who didn't, who abided by Labour's main line on the Gaza war. And of course, in the middle of all that, the actual turnout was record low. Now, it's a bit of an echo, actually, of the successes that Respect had after the Iraq War. There, you had a sort of a half Muslim, half radical left kind of party. But this has really done much better than Respect ever did. But back in the days of the Iraq War, again, you had a lot of people that had protest votes that went to the Lib Dems. The Lib Dem vote increased during that war, and they picked up that. Interestingly, this time, Galloway lost his seat, and the Workers' Party were less successful than the out-and-out independents, except in a handful of seats where they had particularly well-known candidates, or where, again, they had a particularly high Muslim community. Tusk, I've been through the results. I can't find an area where the Trade Union Socialist Coalition did particularly well this time. They seem to be the sort of results that they traditionally get, which is generally not very many. But the thing is, what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for the future of the party, for the future of the class, for the future of class struggle in the country? And I think it's a contradictory picture right now, because we are only 3 weeks in. It's just the first few weeks. And the Labour Party government, the new Labour government, are kind of introducing what you might call easy wins, and particularly, most importantly, cheap wins. They've cancelled the Rwanda scheme. They've announced that the Bibi Stockholm barge is going to be decommissioned come January. They restored the grant to the United Nations Relief Agency. The King's Speech has been issued last week. You had bits of nationalisation. You had the rail companies. Buses were allowed now to be taken into municipal ownership by particular councils. Workers and trade union rights have been promised in this new bill. We'll see what happens in reality, but the King's Speech did promise these reforms. Obviously, on 0 hours contracts, on the question of fire and rehire, we had timid changes, but nonetheless welcome changes that socialists will, of course, be pleased about and welcome. But of course, very timid, and what you might expect, the minimum that you would expect from a Labour government. There's stuff on Great British Energy, with an emphasis now on investment in renewable energy. There's mentions of house building and the abolition of no-fault evictions, finally, which the Tories had promised but never actually delivered on. There's House of Lords reform, again, the most minimal level of House reforms possible, just getting rid of the remaining 92 hereditary peers, like, if you like, finally addressing the scandal which has gone on for 1,000 years of having these people sitting in the Lords as a result of their own parentage. And of course, there's been a suggestion of a conversion therapy ban, but that's open to consultation. And Streeting has already been shockingly callous in the announcements he's made on trans people, and it's not at all sure that trans people will be fully included in the conversion ban. It says it will, but I suspect the consultation process might well see lots of backpedaling on that. So the government are making the right noises in the King's Speech and in a few initial announcements, although they're making some very bad noises as well, which I'll come on to in a minute. But also the devil, of course, is in the detail. You know, there's all consultations, there's plenty of room for backpedaling, for pressure to be applied by the ruling class, by the bosses. Of course, they've started talking with the doctors to try and resolve that dispute. There's a suggestion that they are going to cough up and pay the 5.5% pay offer that has been recommended for public sector workers. So that will be interesting to see whether they actually do it, and if they do it, how they fund it and how they pay for it. So this is the beginning, if you like, of a honeymoon period, but a very short honeymoon period, because the government will actually be judged on child poverty, on lifting the benefit cap, on how they treat universal credit, on living standards after a catastrophic fall over the last 15 to 20 years. And the various sort of vicious clauses of the universal credit laws. There's a question of restoring the National Health Service, the Education Service, social care, which is that they're offering virtually nothing as far as I can see on social care. Local government spending is still slashed, which affects social services. There's no tax rises for the rich planned. Wealth taxes appear to be ruled out. So, you know, one can guarantee that there's not going to be a huge redistribution of wealth and income in favour of working people and their families, to coin a phrase. And it's important to say, of course, that Starmer is already starting way behind Blair. Blair started with a national vote of 43%, and Starmer has only achieved 34%. In my seat in Leighton and Wanstead, Blair achieved 60-odd% in 1997, and eventually, after years of betrayal and moderation and the Iraq War and so on and so forth, the vote in my constituency in 2015 fell to about 45% or thereabouts. But here, Starmer, in Leighton and Wanstead, under Starmer, Labour's vote is already just 47%, rather than the 60% that we got under the days of Tony Blair. And the same happened in his own seat, his own rock-solid, safe Labour seat in Holborn and St Pancras. He got less than 50% of the vote. For a winning Prime Minister's vote to collapse in his own seat is quite extraordinary, and it puts him in a very weak and vulnerable position from the get-go. Of course, there's much more anger over Gaza than Iraq, and this has been fully expressed even before taking office. I mean, Blair, the Gaza crisis, the Iraq crisis hit Blair a couple of years into his government, and now Starmer's starting with this visceral anger amongst wide sections of the community. Blair, of course, was genuinely popular in opinion polls, but Starmer has record-breaking unpopularity. Blair had the benefit of a boom based on a fake boom based on unsustainable debt, whereas Starmer is poised on the verge of another massive slump and a massive crisis from day one, and which is likely to get worse. And that's not even to mention, I haven't got even time to mention tonight, the impending climate catastrophe. He hopes, I think, that he'll be rescued by growth, but there is no evidence that this massive growth is going to come from anywhere. There's lots of talk about incentivizing growth, but here's the thing. If you incentivize growth, if you incentivize investment, then you have to give capitalists what they want in order to persuade them to invest. Capital, as the bosses, will always demand measures to boost profitability and profits, and they're not going to raise extra taxes. So Labour will be forced by the logic of the system they're trying to run to maintain or even increase austerity against working people. They'll be dressed up as difficult choices, blah, 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 blah. Labour councils will now face Labour cuts instead of Tory cuts. So instead of all the leaders of Labour councils that have been implementing cuts, they've been blaming this on Tory cuts for the past 14 years. Well, now they have to blame the same problem on Labour cuts, which has been an interesting variation to the theme, if nothing else. I think in future elections and future by-elections, Labour's in a very difficult position. It's lucky that in the short term, the Tories still seem to be fighting like rats in a sack. But on such a low 34% popular vote, the party is very vulnerable. Dozens of seats could be lost in some Tory, if there was some sort of a deal between the Tories and the Reform Party, or even a merger between those two parties, you could find that those two votes together could easily take back dozens and dozens and dozens of those seats that Labour gained.